This session really is about translation quality assessment. How do you assess the quality of translation? How do you evaluate it? Of course, this is something that many scholars have been talking about. Primarily, I will be talking about only one scholar, which is Julian House, in her book in 2015, which is where she talks about her model. This is the model that she did in 1977, and then revised that model for translation quality assessment in 1997, and in 2015 she actually refined the model again. What does the model, I mean, some might think what the model is. I will talk a little bit about the model, but first of all I need to talk about, within the model you need to understand certain elements, certain terminology, or certain points, aspects that you need to be aware of. Now, the first thing that is extremely important for House is considering translation. She considers translation as a linguistic textual operation. And that is, if you want to go for, see that on page 3 in her book. Then she talks about translation as a linguistic act. This is the focus. She talks about equivalence as well. And she finds that equivalence, which has been brushed away by some other scholars as being unimportant, not as important, it's been marginalized. Equivalence has been marginalized by other scholars, some scholars, and she doesn't like that. So House is saying that translation is a linguistic act. But then she does emphasize also the significance of detailed textual analysis and comparison between the source text and the target text. In other words, when you are going to assess a translation, what do you need to do? You need to analyze the text in details, and analyze the source text and analyze the target text. Both needs to be analyzed, then needs to be compared. Okay? But before we do that, or before talking about that, I will just go back to the word translation as a linguistic act. It's a linguistic act on the one hand, and it's an act of communication across cultures on the other. This is how House looks at translation. Whereas we find Vermeer, who is talking about scopus, as you know, in 1984, Vermeer's view is to abandon equivalence completely and emphasize the scopus or purpose in translation, with focus on the original text. So the focus is looking at the ST. Whereas in the case of House is that you are looking at analyzing the ST and the TT. But the focus in Vermeer, 1984, Vermeer's view is to abandon equivalence completely and emphasize the purpose of translation, or the scopus in translation, with focus on the original text as a mere, look at this, the source text, according to Vermeer, it is a source of information, and to consider the translator as a co-author. In other words, when I'm translating, I am the co-author with the author who wrote the original text. That's according to Vermeer, okay? And that the translation is independent of the source text. It's independent of the source text. It has nothing to do with the source text. The target text is not linked or not, it is independent. And that is something that is one of the fundamental elements. So, according to Vermeer, okay, you're talking about scopus, the purpose of the translation, with the focus on the original text as what? As a source of information, not more than that. So you're just taking the original text just to give you information. That's according to Vermeer. And this is something that House does not like. House compares the ST with the TT and find if there are any matches or mismatches, and then discuss them. And that is how, whereas with Vermeer, he's looking at the source text as a source text as a source of information. That's all. So you just get information from the text, and no more than that. The translation, you are co-authoring. You are co-authoring as a translator. So, and the translation itself is an independent text. The ST is an independent text, which is totally separate from the original. Text, of course. House considers text equivalence at the heart of translation. It is at the heart of translation and quality assessment. So it is at the heart of translation and it's at the heart of quality assessment. If you want to assess a text, then equivalence is the issue that you need to look at. And the translation itself will be considered, according to House, as dependent and derived text from a source text. So this is the difference between Vermeer, who's saying it's completely separate, independent text, the TT, the target text, whereas in the case of House, she's saying that it is dependent and derived text. House actually says equivalence is both a core concept in translation theory and the conceptual basis of translation quality assessment. In other words, equivalence is at the heart of translation and at the heart of assessing any translation to know the quality of that translation. So these two are very, very important. What is equivalence according to her? It is, well, she goes back to the Latin of equal value. She's saying it is of equal value, and that it's not all about they are the same, about sameness or about identity, but it's about equal value, okay, despite of some differences in the which are unavoidable between the source text and the target text. Her approach is basically linking the enveloping context. That's what I talked about before, that you cannot translate text only. There's an interconnectedness of text and context, okay? And it's situational context. Of course, there's so the context is enveloping the text, or the enveloping text assessed through, how do you assess it? You assess it through some parameters that has to do with lexical choice and structural choice, and it is represented in the textual material. That's according to House. So the translation needs, translation itself, it needs to satisfy these three criteria, which is lexical, structural, which is syntax, and textual, three different means. Lexical means what kind of words, structural, syntax, and then you look at the textual, which is how to create a good, strong cohesion in the target text. And this has been, according to House, is to do lexical, syntactic, and textual analysis of the source text, and do also the same in the target for the target text. And then when you are comparing the source text with the target text, you look at the matches and mismatches. Of course, I have noticed, especially when I am applying this model to some translations that I have done, in the analysis of some translations that I came across, I have found that the idiomatic language, covert translation is ideal for idiomatic items or expressions, where you look at the equivalence, which is the functional equivalence. They are very useful. Overt translation usually, as House is saying, when she's right to say so, in scientific texts. So scientific texts are the ones that you use overt language, or overt translation rather, as an approach. So there are two approaches, which is overt and covert translation. And overt is for the scientific, mostly in the scientific, used in scientific texts, whereas covert, I mean, I'm just sort of being general here, because I don't want to go too specific. It's very complex. If you need to read the whole book to understand them deeply, the overt and covert. I will talk about them in another session. Now, just going back to the criteria, the defined criteria for translation quality assessment. House, of course, she's talking about about the criteria. She summarizes the source text and the relationship. See, she's looking at the criteria as being the original text, the relationship between original and translation, and the expectations of the target language or target text readers. These are three elements or three criteria that needs to be satisfied in the translation. Original text, relationship between original and translation, and expectation of the target audience, target readers. Of course, I mean, in terms of the original text, these three elements that you need to satisfy according to House. House also presents clearly defined criteria for quality assessment, translation quality assessment. In her evaluation, the characteristics or the characteristic features of a translation is to do the textual profile of the TT. So you have two profiles. One profile, one textual profile of the ST and one of the TT. Now, in her evaluation, the characteristic features of a translation, that is the textual profile of the TT, are judged in their correspondence. That's the thing. How do they correspond? In their correspondence to the features of the original text. In other words, the textual profile of the TT needs to correspond to the textual profile of the ST. And that is very, very important. In response to, for example, I mean, looking at other scholars who have looked at translation quality assessment, their approaches are different. For example, Venuti in 1995 has got a different approach. And in that approach, we see that how Hauser assesses or asserts that with regards to Venuti's approach, she asserts that translation is, after all, a linguistic procedure. However conditioned this procedure is, maybe through ideological shifts and skews. For example, you see any texts, I mean, this is Baker as well, 2011 as well. They talk about ideology shifts, so that the text has got a hidden agenda. But what House is saying is that, as far as I understand it here, she's saying that the procedure has to be linguistic. When you are drawing the profile of the ST, the TT, you need to see if the features of that profile matches or correspond to the textual profile of the TT. If it does match, then that's good. Now, of course, if we go to Venuti talks about and also Baker when they talk about ideology and translation. And in ideology and translation, they are talking about power relations and power struggles, how power and injustices as well, the social injustices or and then, of course, they want to reflect, the texts do reflect certain ideologies sometimes, especially if they are political texts. They reflect some certain ideology. Actually, not necessarily only political, but there are some texts that are of religious nature, for example. They will reflect also ideologies related to religion as well. And then these ideological shifts, and which is like noticed or observed by Baker and by Venuti, they would show and they promote. They show how the unequal power relations, these power relations going on, or injustices being in the text. And also there is there's the element of you need to introduce you need to look at the textual element in particular. There are others who talk about socio-political act, translation as a socio-political act, like Robinson in 1997. Also, he talks about translation as a socio-political act with intervention in translation that can contribute to an ethical practice in the production and reading of translation. Yes, it does actually have some ethical element here, but you see the problem. I mean, what is House is saying? It's inviting assessors of the translation to engage seriously, not at the macro level of assessment. It has to go into the micro level, the micro perspective, by conducting, as I said earlier, detailed theoretical, this is a quotation actually, by House on page 13 in her book 2015, where she says that you have to conduct a detailed, theoretical, informed analysis of the linguistic forms and their functions, whether their functions are semantic or pragmatic in the text at hand, whatever text that you have. Then there is the issue of Derrida's approach in 1985, where it's characterized by throwing some doubt over the concept of meaning. He says, what's meaning? He's sort of like, there is a difference, and he's saying that the meaning is unstable linguistically. How can it be unstable linguistically? The meaning has to be stable linguistically, unless there is vagueness or ambiguity in the text. If there is ambiguity in the text, then there is an issue. Yes, but usually meaning has to be constantly stable. It needs to be, well, constantly, according to Derrida, the meaning is constantly unstable linguistically. How can it be? Unless the text itself, or let's say, for example, there is a sentence or there is a clause where it has two meanings. Yes. Sometimes it might have more than two meanings if it's ambiguous. If the text is ambiguous or intended to be ambiguous, then yes, the meaning is unstable linguistically. But you have to decide of what the meaning is, otherwise you cannot translate. How can you translate if the meaning is unstable linguistically? I mean, he talks about difference or difference. Difference refers to that the meaning has no stable identity. Stable identity. If it has got no stable identity, how can I translate? I won't be able to translate anything then, if there is no stable identity to the meaning of the text or to the expression that I have. Of course, let's go back, if you go back to the linguistic approaches that we know about, because we're talking about linguistically, but there is Nida, there is Catford Nida 1964, Catford 1965, Newbert 1985, and also Koller, he's the German scholar as well. They illustrate the relationship between text or its features and how these features are perceived by human agents, whether these agents are authors, translators, or readers. But they do not provide, as, and she's right to say so, House, in her approach, they do not provide detailed account of for analysis and evaluation. How can you analyze it? How can you actually evaluate a text without detailed account of the text that you have? Detailed account of the source text, detailed account of the target text, and what I'm talking about the profile, the textual profile of the TT and its correspondence to the textual profile of the ST in terms of lexical, syntactic, and textual, which is a much more general related to the convention, to the cohesion, sorry. How this view takes into account the interconnectedness of context with text. And I showed you in today's earlier, when I was translating from, if you look at my video called Translating into Arabic, translating from Arabic into English, looking at the interconnectedness of context and text. In other words, recontextualization that helps in meaning making and in translation. And this is seen in the model, linguistic model of translation assessment by House in 1977 and 1997, and also later in 2009 as well. Rees, on the other hand, okay, it says that it is essential to determine the function of the translation and the text type of the source text. So these text types are three text types, which are Bohler's three text types. Content-oriented texts, which is scientific texts, form-oriented texts, which is literary texts, and appellative or conative texts, which are advertisements and argumentative texts. And of course, there is also recently introduced the audio-medial texts, which are related to the media. These text types need to be met according to Rees. So according to Rees, 1968, 1971, 1973, this is what she has to say about text types. So you have to consider text types as well, okay? But of course, it is the actual, if you're looking at these ones, text types, such text types needs to be met, have their equivalent in order to achieve to be adequate in translation. So in order to make the translation adequate, according to Rees, you have to meet these text types, the four of them. And the fourth type, which is the audio-medial texts, the effect of the source text needs to be upheld in the TT. But this effect or the function, this is the issue with Rees. You can't show how the function and the effect of a text are established. How do you do that? And this is according to House when she's criticizing Rees, and that you can see on page 15 if you are interested in reading that. Now, if you look at Koller, which is another author, scholar, German, he talks about translation quality assessment. And he has also developed his own model, Koller's model, which consists of three stages. Source text criticism, with a view to ascertain translatability or transferability. Can you transfer it? Is it untransferable or transferable? This is the issue. So whether it's transferable or not untransferable. And also looking at transferability into the target language, of course, and description of the particular method of translation used as well. So we need to know the method that's been used. So his Koller's view or model is to look at the transferability, okay, into the transferability of the source text into the target language, the description of the model or method of translation that's been used, and finally is to look at, and then you finally assess the translation for its adequacy, if it's adequate adequate based on the features found in the first stage and measured again a native speaker's judgment. Wills, 1974, suggests objectivity of translation quality assessment through the norm of usage. How is it used in a given community in relation to a given situation? And the native speaker is to judge its norm of usage. That's the problem. It's the norm of usage. Is it this is the norm, how it is being used. But the problem is, I mean, what houses are criticizing Will's model, saying that it's difficult or it's different to establish what a valid norm of usage is in the target text. So that is another element there. Van den Broek is 1985 and 1986, has got an approach to quality by triangulation procedure, where contrastive pragmatic analysis of the ST and TT. So you have to compare between them, contrast between the ST and the TT, and this analysis will look at the internal textual relations and function of the ST as well. Now I'm just going to stop here because I think I've just given some the first first episode explaining Howe's model in relation to other models that are in the TQA, which is Translation Quality Assessment. Thank you.